On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, it's the great battleship debate. Hood versus Bismarck, Hiroshima versus Washington, and Cooper versus Konrad. That's right. We're going to discuss the battleship proposed by the U.S. Navy. We're going to be doing a lot of ship talk on this episode. So first, I want to bring on Zach Cooper from the American Enterprise Institute. He's a senior fellow over there and one of the people on one of my favorite podcasts in the world, the Net Assessment Podcast. Over there with Melanie Marlowe and Chris Preble. Zach, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sal. Really happy you're doing this.
I'm happy to have you on, and I'm looking forward to this. And then arguing the pro battleship side is good friend of the show, Captain John Konrad, CEO over at gCaptain. John, how we doing?
We're doing great. I feel like I'm the underdog coming into this battleship debate because the consensus around DC definitely seems some skepticism, but I'm excited to get started here.
I think, number one, this is going to be a great one. To understand the background of this, Zach, you over at Net Assessment did a great episode. I'll have it linked in the show notes here, talking about the battleship. I thought you, Melanie, and Chris did a great job kind of discussing that. John, you're an unabashed fan of the battleship, as I understand. Matter of fact, I believe I prominently displayed an image of you cheering when the battleship was announced by the Secretary of the Navy and the President. So I can honestly say I think we've got both sides of this covered, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. I think it's going to be a lot of fun for us to do. One of the things I wanted to do real quick before we jump into this is just kind of talk a little bit about this. So this is the proposal. Back in December of 2025, President Trump, along with then Secretary of the Navy, John Phelan, along with the Secretary of Defense or War, depending on what day it is, came out and announced the construction of what was going to be the Trump-class battleship, the USS Defiant, which is an interesting name, never used before in the history of the United States, used quite extensively in Star Trek, but not really within the U.S. Navy. But this is kind of the model that they have set out, the idea of a large, massive surface combatant. So I thought we would kick this off. I asked Zach to kind of do a quick little opening here and introduce himself a little bit and talk about his view on the battleship. And then we're going to kick on over to John and have John do it. And I got a series of hard-hitting, biting questions that I have set for them. And I'm looking for a really lively debate. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Zach.
Great. Well, thanks again, Sal, for doing this. I'm really happy we're having this conversation and looking forward to John's comments. So as you noted, we talked a little bit about the battleship on that assessment, and I sort of had three critiques of it. And let me start by saying I'm a fan of shipbuilding. So it's not a question for me of whether we should be building ships. It's more a question of which ships to build. So the first question in my mind is, how does this fit into broader U.S. force design? And here, John, I genuinely want to know what the answer is. I have tried to go on the website for the Navy and get some of the details. Unfortunately, when you go to goldenfleet.usnavy.mil, which is what the Navy always talks about, you get a webpage under construction sign. So I think John may know way more about this than I do. But so the first question I have is, how does this fit into the broader shipbuilding plan? So, my impression is that the Navy for a while has been trying to move towards more distributed operations. And this sort of re-centralizes a lot of capability in one ship. And you've been very eloquent on X about explaining why there might be benefit to that. So that's the first question in my mind is, how does this fit into the broader shipbuilding plan? The second question in my mind is about cost. So I saw the budget come out just a couple of weeks ago. It has $17.5 billion in there for one ship, which would be acquired in FY28. There's no development money. It's all procurement as far as I can tell. And so one big question in my mind is, first, do you think that $17.5 billion is a realistic figure? I know there have been some estimates that are quite a bit higher based on the tonnage we've seen of, maybe 30,000 tons and what a relative cost per ton is for other Navy ships. And the related question is, do we think that that's the best way to spend that money? So I guess in my mind, I think a lot about the China fight. I wrote a book called Ties of Fortune, which looks a little bit at how Navy capabilities have changed over the last 100, 150 years. And I think the surface assets are increasingly at risk. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have them and shouldn't use them, but going to something like putting a lot of that money into submarines might be more cost effective. So interested in your view on that, John. And then the last one is more a political feasibility question. So my sense from Capitol Hill is that there's a pretty mixed view up there. And my sense from talking to some Democrats is that if they were to, come into power, that this would be one of the first things they would cancel. And so I'm worried that we're going to put, I think, $19 billion into the battleship program over the next 3 years, according to the budget. And then if Democrats come in and they're not convinced of the value of a battleship, or a different Republican administration comes in, that they might kill the whole program and we'll basically be out that $19 billion. So those were the three big critiques that we had on the show, but looking forward to John's insights into this.
No, that's great. And I like those three. And we're going to address each of those on our questions coming forward. John, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'd like to start. And I wrote some criticism on X, which was the start of this debate. And on the next episode, a net assessment, I think you came in, Zach, and said the story has not been explained by the Navy. And without that story being explained, it's very hard to get all of these processes together. I agree fully on that. I think that you can build tanks, convert a auto factory relatively quick. You can do a stealth bomber in a hidden warehouse somewhere, but shipbuilding really requires buy-in from Congress, buy-in from other cabinet secretaries, Department of Labor, Department of Commerce, Treasury, to get Wall Street involved, and the U.S. Maritime Administration, DOT. So absolutely agree. This story has not been explained well. I think the fundamental thing with the battleship is my real focus on the logistics of the fight, the logistics winning wars. And the U.S. Merchant Marine is in deep trouble right now. The U.S. Merchant Marine crews about 40% of Navy ships, including military Sea Lift Command ships. We don't have enough ammo ships. We don't have enough oilers. And we don't have any protection on those ships. Now, the ocean is large. I am also primarily focused on the China fight. Getting all of those logistics over there is going to be difficult. We can arrest ships. We have some ships we can use. And I talked to CNO Caudle about this. The current Navy plan is distribute those logistics across the oceans to kind of hide them and make more targets that are harder to hit. But the problem is these ships have to converge at some point, whether it be the Strait of Hormuz, which we're seeing now, or the Taiwan Strait, or what I think is even more important, the Luzon Strait, potentially the Bering Strait. You need to be able to hold those choke points. Now, the destroyers have done an excellent job in the Red Sea. They are really effective against the Houthis. And the Houthis are bandits. They're not the most intelligent and well-organized group, but they have been using Iranian drones, Iranian missiles, and a lot of that technology comes from China. Well, what we've seen is just the Houthis attacking all of these ships and the destroyers coming in there and doing an excellent job. Problem is the cost differential between sending a VLS missile towards these drone swarms. That's one massive problem. Second massive problem is you have very limited number of VLSLs, about 96 on a destroyer and 1/3 anti-submarine, 1/3 Tomahawk. So you only have 1/3 of that. And we have very difficulty reloading those VLS cells. These destroyers have to go into port. On top of that, the destroyers use a lot of fuel staying on station, and we don't have oilers. We don't have protection. Our military sea lift fleet does not have enough oilers to really get into that fight, and those oilers are not protected. So what I primarily want to see is an ability to hold that choke point. So we need a destroyer with larger magazine depth and a lot more room for fuel bunkers on board that ship so it can stay on station longer. I also want additional survivability on that ship in case some of these drones come through. And we look at all of these, these costs, the $17 billion. Well, that's building it to naval standards. It's putting all of the bells and whistles inside for survivability. That is all excellent. But what the Navy has not done is looked at the survivability of modern merchant ships. These Houthis sent thousands of drones and missiles against merchant ships in the Red Sea. We've had Iran attack ships in the Strait of Hormuz. They've managed to sink a subtotal of one ship, and that ship was drifting for 13 days. The other ships that they sunk, they had to go on and put explosive charges on. So I think you can really reduce the cost of the hull if you do more of a merchant design. And finally, final point is if we have a battle against China, you are going to have to send boots on the ground to the Luzon Strait, Taiwan Strait, any of these choke points. We need bombardment capability. We need to give those Marines more than the 30-something Tomahawk missiles that they would have in a destroyer in order to take that ground. And I think a battleship has that depth of magazines that can be effective.
All right. So I was just up on the Battleship Wisconsin for an event. So it's been weird. I've had these events recently, and I've been on quite a few battleships here I was up on New Jersey back in October, and then over here up onto Wisconsin. When those battleships were reactivated back in the 80s, they were centerpieces for Reagan's 600 ship Navy. He was talking about putting together 15 carrier strike groups and 4 surface action groups. Each was centered on a battleship. And so I guess my question, the first question off the bat is what role do these ships fit within the force structure of the Navy? John, you kind of alluded to that a bit just now, but I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. Why does the U.S. Navy need a large surface combatant? Because this is not new in many ways. Yes, it's a battleship, but if you go back and peel this apart, you can find the history of the strike cruiser and a whole, CGX. There's a lot of issues associated with it. So can you put it in maybe a little bit more context in how you foresee how this battleship would be used within the force structure? And then I'll come back to Zach here for his answer.
Well, I think there's a presence mission, but what we have to understand, and I agree with Zach, we need more submarines. Submarines is our greatest advantage over China. Submarines do not work well inside these choke points. I don't want to change the entire force structure, but to get those logistics into the fight, we need a plan for holding those choke points, and these battleships are it. There are other missions it can do, presence missions, showing the flag, possibly escort. This particular Trump-class battleship is going to be a command and control module for drones, so it can sail with ships that are able to launch drone swarms and be that command and control module. But the main focus is this choke point. I want the destroyers, but I want them bigger, and you need that gunfire support. You need that survivability into securing those choke points so that our merchant ships are protected. And this is why I'm so passionate about this topic. The Navy has not shown us an alternative to protecting ships. The submarines can't protect merchant ships, doing nothing to protect merchant ships in the Red Sea and the Hormuz. The carriers do an okay job, but we've talked extensively with Chowder Hill, who was the CEO of in the Red Sea, and they say that the destroyers are the effective. And what is not reported, because the Navy has not done a very good job in talking about this, and a lot of this information is classified, we saw the French frigates use their deck guns to shoot down drones effectively in the Red Sea. My sources are telling me inside the Navy, we used those 5-inch guns a lot more than is being reported, that was part of the magazine depth, that was the ability. But on top of those 5-inch guns, you also have the ability, because the Arleigh Burke, we can't fit anything else in. They are already chock full of sensors and weapons. If you want to put in lasers, you want to put in additional CWIS, CRAM, all of these other things, or you want to bring someone like Anduril to put new weapon systems on board, we just can't do it with the destroyer. We need just a larger footprint to put this stuff on.
Zach, I'll go over to you for your comment.
Yeah, so first, I think this point that John's making about the logistics is really, really important. And I wish the Navy talked about it more. I know that's probably not what the president's particularly interested in when he talks about battleships. He likes the firepower. But I think the logistics point is really interesting. I guess the way I've been thinking about this is I think we've seen a shift in the balance between what I would call control and denial. People in the naval world talk about this a lot. People in other domains talk about it less so. Right, sea control has become harder and harder. Sea denial is becoming easier and easier, or I would say really less costly in relative terms. And that's part of what my dissertation looked at. And so I think there's a core question here, which is, to what extent should the US Navy be trying to maintain sea control? And to what extent do we have to fall back on sea denial? And my guess is that, unfortunately, we're going to have to fall back on sea denial more than we'd like. I think that's sort of part of the story that we're seeing in the Strait of Hormuz now. You know, both sides can do sea denial fairly effectively. Neither one at the moment is able to do sea control, or at least we're not able to do it at a risk level that the President of the United States is willing to accept. And so my guess is that if we look at a China contingency, we also are going to have the same problem. I'm not sure that either side is going to be able to execute sea control. I think both are going to have much more minimal objectives. I think we're going to end up with basically a very large no man's land where neither side is able to operate surface ships with any level of confidence. And then the question is, well, what do you do with force design? I think one option would be, well, let's go to these smaller, more distributed units that are harder for your opponent to hit. You know, this is how you get Marines in Philippines or the Southwest Islands in Japan. Maybe you rely more on submarines, and the surface ships are staying further away. I think the other option, and I do think this is really interesting, is you do what John's suggesting. You put more onto defendable platforms. I guess the question I would have on that front is, if I were doing that, and I think, John, you pointed at this with the point about the ship guns, you know, I would think you'd want to put real defenses on there that have very, very large salvo capabilities, which for me would mean directed energy, which would mean huge energy density in the ships, maybe thinking about going to like nuclear power, even on some non-carrier surface ships. So I think that logic would make some sense to me. I'd have questions about the cost benefit calculus, but I think unless we do that, I'm worried that those surface ships are going to get completely overwhelmed, not just with the shorter range cruise missiles and drones, but also with, you know, the anti-ship ballistic missile capabilities that the Chinese have been building up for a long time. And I worry that the cost ratio of our interceptors to the Chinese missiles is so impossible for us to manage that the Chinese will always build more missiles that have some anti-ship capability, and we're never going to be able to build enough interceptors. So that's kind of my worry as I try and think through the force design question.
I think you guys raised some great questions, and it kind of phases into the next one here really well. Is one of the things we see throughout military and naval history are these kind of revolutions in affairs and how we do things. I go back to the idea of HMS Victory at the Battle of Trafalgar had been in commission for over 50 years, and she was such a huge platform that you could change the cannons on there and update it and really make a platform that didn't matter how old it was. It could be in service for almost 100 years. In active service. Same thing, you know, if you look in the 20th century, if Congress had the 30-year shipbuilding plan in effect, you know, at the turn of the 20th century, would battleships even be on there? Dreadnoughts. I mean, the dreadnought doesn't come in until 1906. Would aircraft carriers be in the 1910 30-year building plan? Would ballistic missile submarines be in the 1950 plan? I mean, we wouldn't even know these these technologies existed. And so I go to this idea is what John and what the proposal here is this the next revolution in naval affairs? Do we need to go, big? Do we need to build a huge platform that has the capability to have this massive array of weaponries on here? Or do we go the small route? Again, I think the issue here is we've seen how the Ukrainians been able to fight naval wars without navies. And it's very much the guerre de corps kind of style. Are we doing the small combatants versus the big battleships? And I think we're kind of in that discussion today. So Zach, I'll kick it off with you on this one. What are we at a point with this revolution in naval affairs where bigger is better, or should we be focusing on the smaller capabilities that many are arguing are working right now in places like the Black Sea, the Red Sea, and potentially in the Strait of Hormuz?
Yeah, I love your framing of this, Sal, because I think you're right that, Jackie Fisher, the British strategy around the turn of the 20th century is in many ways the place to start. And I think there's sort of this romantic notion that in that era, and it's true, dreadnoughts were the answer for a lot of reasons. One, which was that you had greater firepower. You also had greater ability to defend the ship. And as a result, you had both firepower and protection, and dreadnoughts were able to really rule the seas for a period. I think my fear now is that because there's so much firepower, not in a dreadnought type of capability, but in a relatively cheap missile system that can be fired from land and elsewhere and can go very long distances and have accuracy independent of range, that as a result, the ability to protect against that incoming missile is incredibly costly. It's not impossible, but it's very costly. So I guess my answer would be, if the battleship were the new revolution in military affairs, I think what it would require is the ability, probably with directed energy or maybe some railgun related development, to actually defend the ship against everything that would be incoming, right? And that seems like it might be possible to me. It also seems like the Navy has stopped and started on this for years. And so, when I look at the battleship diagrams, there's a little of that seems built in, but it doesn't seem based around that logic. And so for me, that suggests that actually the better way to go would be to go to these smaller, cheaper, more distributed systems. But I think John's point is exactly right that, well, then the hard question is, how do you do logistics? We've seen with the Air Force that, they have a distributed concept, which I'm not sure anybody really believes is going to work. And so I think we have to ask hard questions on the naval side as well. But I definitely come down in the view that, what the Ukrainians are doing pretty effectively at sea, what the Iranians are trying to do, although much less effectively at sea, is probably the easier way to, say, deny China the ability to take Taiwan, rather than trying to buy back sea control. But I think this is part of what I would like to see the Navy make the case for when they talk about the battleship. And so glad that, that John's actually had this conversation with folks in the Navy who are thinking about this.
Yeah, I think you raise a lot of good points there. I go back to the George Bush aircraft carrier, where they put all this brand new technology on one single platform. And Bush coming off a very successful deployment, very long deployment here coming off. But I mean, there was a lot of teething pains to get that ship up and running to the point of where it is today. And a lot of the technology that they're talking about here for this battleship, rail guns and massive weapons and energy, that really has not been fielded at this point. Well, John, I go back to you. Is this the next evolutionary step that we see in the revolution of naval affairs?
Well, I have to admit that I was pushing for the battleship for 2 years, but I had absolutely nothing to do with the design. I have questions about the design. One of the problems with the 5-inch guns on the destroyer is you only have one. So if that malfunctions, you are kicking back on the Sea Whiz. And a lot of destroyer captains don't want to do that, so they end up using the missiles first and run out of that capability. You absolutely need redundancy at sea. Now, this has 2 5-inch guns, but each turret is on one side, and then on each side is just a turret, an individual turret on both sides. Where you saw in the battleships of World War II, let's say, where you had multiple gun systems, multiple redundancies. If one jammed, you could potentially fire another round next to it. So I'm not sold on this battleship design. The rail guns, that is a significant problem. We saw with the Zumwalt, but there are easier fixes for that. We saw with the Zumwalt, I think it was the 155 millimeter. The Navy could never get that. The cost of each round was $250,000 to $500,000 a round, and these fire at high speed. But the Army had perfected it with a very similar gun. The Navy trying to fit this themselves. Deck guns are not very difficult things to do. And we saw with the Chinese Coast Guard, very few people remember, but 15 years ago, the Chinese Coast Guard's number one claim was, hey, we are an unarmed fleet of vessels. And then in a very short period of time, I believe it was a matter of months, they brought these ships in, cut a hole in it, dropped deck guns on the Coast Guard ship, and was able to weaponize those. I think we have to look at how we can weaponize these ships. And I go back to one comment about what you said previously, Zach, that it's very difficult to escort these ships through. We just saw 2 U.S. flag ships make it through the Strait of Hormuz. There were potential attacks. We've seen that in the Red Sea. What we have found, though, is they need close escort with the destroyers. They need Marines on board to protect those ships. They need communications officers, strategic sea lifts officers. You have to come with a developed plan. You need that command and control module close by. You can't do this from Tampa, Florida. It has to be near those ships. And I think that is the opportunity that the battleship provides, this close support for the merchant ships. Finally, I think Zach makes an excellent point with the Ukraine war and these missiles that potentially China has. I am not sold on the missiles, Zach. I think hitting a ship that is moving is a lot more difficult that we found. I know they are not of the quality of Chinese missiles, but we had over 100 Iranian missiles fired at a carrier, and these destroyers were able to shoot down them all. Second is, as we said earlier, we've had missiles hit these new commercial ship designs with double hull strength, with more survivability, and they are very effective at disabling merchant ships, but we still haven't seen any merchant ships sunk. What the Ukrainians have, which is very effective, is these surface boats. And I think those are potentially effective. But why is that? It is because these autonomous surface drones, they have 2 advantages. One, they can hold a lot more explosive weight on board because they don't have to fly through the air. And second, when you have an explosives on the waterline, that water is a reflective effect that essentially doubles the explosive charge up into the hull. So I think all ships are very susceptible to these surface drones, but I'm not sold that the aerial weaponry has enough explosive force. And I want to go back to the Air Force released a video that everyone's talking about a couple of years ago about these JDAM bombs that are going and sinking a ship. And it's a incredible video. You see the bomber coming in and dropping the bomb, and it explodes in the ship, and then the ship starts to sink. But to a mariner's eye, when Sal and I look at it, we see it was a very old ship, single hull design. It had a lot of rust in it, and they left all the hatches open. So I am not sold that these Chinese missiles can hit a moving battleship that's highly maneuverable and potentially sink it and get through these additional weapon system. But what I would really like the Navy to do is test it. Let's bring these ships out. Let's move ships that we are decommissioning, and let's try to hit them until I see those hard statistics on how survivable ships are against our hypersonics and our anti-ship missiles. I'm skeptical that ships are not survivable. And finally, the real question is, okay, if ships aren't survivable, how are we moving those logistics? Because the entire air lift capacity of the Air Force is less than the cargo capacity of one modern Chinese mega container ship. So I don't see an alternative to ships, so we have to secure them.
So I want to go to the third question. I'm going to change it up a little bit because you've kind of talked about it, both of you, a little bit here. And I was going to talk about Epic Fury and then the role that a battleship would fit into this. But I think if you look broader scope, we look at what's been happening over the past 5 to 10 years. We've had multiple operations, naval operations undergoing. We've had the Black Sea, we've had the Red Sea. There's a lot going on, and there's obviously a mixed result of that. If you look at the Black Sea, obviously the Moskva, which was the big Russian cruiser, was sunk by shore-based missiles, probably 2 modified Harpoon, what they call Neptune missiles, and sunk there. And I'm not comparing Moskva to what this battleship would be, because this is a very outdated technology. It's also Russian, so it's got inherent flaws in it to begin with there. But I do think that, I guess my question is, how does a battleship fit into those type of scenarios, and what else can it be used for? I go back to an event that happened in 1946 when the U.S. was in the midst of the beginning of the Cold War, and one of the things that Harry Truman did was, when the Turkish ambassador died in the United States, he had the battleship Missouri bring the body of the ambassador back to Istanbul, and it was very symbolic. The battleship Missouri, in which the Japanese had surrendered at at Tokyo Bay. It was very symbolic. It was, and a battleship is a very unique type of platform. It looks a certain way. It's meant to convey power. So I guess I would go back into this issue about, how does the battleship either fit into some of those operations we've seen, the Red Sea, the Black Sea, and you've mentioned already Epic Fury, or the larger context of why we need this, and why this would be such an important platform, or do we not get enough out of this? Is it waste of money and we better allocate resources somewhere else? John, I'll start off with you and then go over to Zach.
Yeah, I don't think that we need 20 of these. I don't think we need as many of these as the aircraft carrier, but you're absolutely right for showing the flag, for, show what we are capable of doing. You and I, Sal, were on the Kavash Ship podcast when it came out that these would cost $17 billion a piece. First of all, I would say, look at Biden's rural internet program that costs $40-something billion and connected 0 homes. Pete Buttigieg, under the infrastructure plan, was given $1.1 trillion. How many $15 billion battleships can you do for that? And we still have problems with the road. So I don't think $17 billion is that expensive if you look at the budget. But the question is, why is it so much more than a nuclear aircraft carrier? And I agree completely with Zach. These things should be nuclear. I think the plan now, and Bill Tody has come out and said, we got to get the first 2 or 3 built conventionally so we can prove we can do it. And they're not closing the door for nuclear for the next 6 or 7 after that. So I think that is good. That nuclear would slow it down. But the cost is, and right after that podcast episode, someone at the White House called me up directly and said, I hate to tell you, John, but you're wrong, because I told Kavash Ships it doesn't make sense to me that it would be more than $8 billion. $8 billion. I've built ships at Samsung. I spent a year and a half at the most advanced shipyard in the world, and that number is crazy. And what this individual, who would not go on the record in saying, is, well, half of that cost is because we need the equipment, we need the rolling mills, we need to push money into the steel manufacturers. We have to distribute this cash to the various shipyards around. So I still question that full cost. But what are you getting with that $17 billion that the first ones will cost? I think the number one thing you're getting, and it's the thing I got the most pushback on X, is you're selling this to the American people. You're getting the youth excited. And when I go to Washington, D.C., everyone is negative on the battleship. Almost everyone. Everyone is questioning. Everyone looks at the cost overruns, the shipbuilding problems, and says, we can't do this. But over Christmas, I was talking about the battleship with my nephew, and his eyes lit up. Here in Massachusetts, I live in the most liberal town in the most liberal county of Massachusetts. And people here don't know these arguments. They've never heard net assessment. They don't know, but they get excited. Liberal, conservative, when I talk to my mechanic, when I go, I was just in San Diego looking at colleges with my daughter. When you talk to the average person, now the average person is not happy that Trump's putting his name on it. I think that is a political misstep. But if you talk about just building a larger ship, it gets excited. It particularly gets these high school kids excited to get in there. So if we only build 2 battleships and we never have a war and we don't need them for choke, I think this exercise is a muscle. It shows that we have to do it. And let me tell you something else. $17 billion is not enough to build a battleship. We cannot build this battleship that Trump wants for $17 billion. I don't think we could build it for $50 billion unless we really adopt how I built ships in South Korea. This forces us to transform to this truly modular design where we're not looking at these pristine ships. We're doing more of a survivable commercial design and building it modularly around the country and more assembled in a first-rate yard like HII.
All right. Well, we're going to talk about that shipbuilding in the next question here coming up. And I'm a little disturbed that people are not listening to net assessment in Western Massachusetts. I think that's the concern that I take away from that. Zach, so for you, how does this fit in? How would this battleship fit in those scenarios we kind of talked about there?
Yeah, I guess this is part of the question. I think John hit on it. I think some people think of this as sort of the equivalent of the Great White Fleet, right? This is in part about public messaging. And I buy that there's some value there. I think it's a question of, can we afford the cost? I will say when the battleship was announced in December, I was not expecting that the Trump administration was actually going to be talking really about a $1.5 trillion defense budget. And so part of the reason that I was so critical when it came out was I just didn't think that there was going to be money in the budget at all, and that this was going to be stealing from other priorities. If we're actually putting hundreds of billions of dollars into the budget, I think there's more ability to do something of this sort. I still question whether President Trump's idea, when he talked in the first term about redoing the carrier, and a friend of mine who was in the room said, look, the president is very worried about where the bridge is on the carrier because he wants it to look a certain way. He's not so worried about like the operations of it. He just wants it to look tough. I'm not a huge fan of doing anything that costs a lot of money for that reason. But I think that means, well, what's the operational case for it? And I can see the value in a non-China contingency potentially, where maybe the threat level is lower because your opponent has less good missiles or fewer of them. I think what I worry about in the China contingency is whether a political leader would put these assets at risk. And maybe the 3 of us would say, look, you have to if you want to win the fight. But I fear, having done lots of war games, that political leaders, when faced with this question right now, would probably leave not just the battleship, but even a carrier strike group way far away from the fight, maybe like out towards Guam or even further, for fear that they're going to get hit by, either an anti-ship ballistic missile or, maybe by an H-6K bomber with a long-range missile added onto it. Maybe they'll be worried about unmanned systems or submarines on the Chinese side. So the fear that I have is, are we going to end up in this situation where, yes, the battleship is sort of this prestige project. But when it comes to the warfight in the China context in particular, the battleship is way out towards Guam. And just one last thought on this, which is, I think all of us have probably had the experience of trying to explain operationally, for example, why you've got to get in close and you've got to throw some punches at the Chinese early. You probably need to try hitting the mainland in some cases. I think we can all make the military operational argument for why to do that. I think when you ask the political question about whether a political leader is going to accept that level of risk of having, however many people it would be on a battleship put at risk, I think the danger is that they're going to say no, even if the operationally expert folks are going to say you've got to do it. So I just worry that when push comes to shove, we might see this asset 1,000, 2,000 miles away from the fight. And let me say just one last thing. So it's a little awkward for me to argue that we don't necessarily want to put our money into battleships. Because I've been trying to argue against some people like our old friend Bridge Colby, who've been saying, look, the old surface Navy is sort of not helpful at all in a fight. I think the surface Navy is helpful. I just think at the start of the fight, it's hard for me to imagine the surface Navy playing a huge role in the first couple of days. But I do think there's a big role later in a contingency where you're going to have to bring the surface Navy back in. I can see the value of the battleship potentially in some of those scenarios. I'm just not sure it's the most cost-effective platform at that point of the fight.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of mixed messages that we have coming from this, and it's really a difficult one. I agree with you, Zach. It's hard to assess that if you're looking at what's happening right now in the Persian Gulf with the deployment of 2 destroyers into the Persian Gulf and then coming out. That's week 10 we're into now, and we're having that fight right there. If you look at the deployment of battleships, you mentioned the Great White Fleet. Some are using this is the Great Golden Fleet. The Great White Fleet, when it does its global mission, those battleships were obsolete by the time they're heading around. You're building Dreadnought at the time up in England. But, one of the things was, it doesn't matter if they're technologically obsolete. It was the show. It was meant to show that the U.S. could do this and deploy a fleet worldwide, which I think is a really interesting one. And I think it's a great debate you guys are having on this, and I like this a lot. All right, the next question is this one, which I think is an important one. Can we even build a battleship? John was alluding to how we go about do that, but can we? Because I got to tell you, the track record in Navy building right now has not been stellar in many ways. We've had issues with the Ford-class carrier. I mean, Ford doesn't go into operations for almost a decade after it's built. You had issues, obviously, with the littoral combat ship, which we're not going to go into because that's a long, lengthy one. You have issues with the frigate that we can't even get a frigate built. There are obviously difficulties with this. And this building program, building a ship of this scale, this size, is a daunting one. Now, on the flip side of that, probably the greatest maritime renaissance we've had since like the 1890s is going on right now. You've got everything from the Maritime Action Plan to the Ships Act to the executive order by the president. There's more focus and attention on shipbuilding in the United States than ever before. There's a recognition that the Chinese are outbuilding us 230 to 1, according to the Office of Naval Intelligence. So, Zach, go to you on this one. Can we even do this, or is this going to wind up being another notch in the belt of kind of failed Navy shipbuilding programs that will go down with other ones we've had in the past?
So look, you guys have actually built ships, so you'll have more expertise on this. But here's my fear. I worry, as you were saying, Sal, that when I look at Navy shipbuilding and the shipbuilding plan the last decade, 2 decades, it's just a disaster. Almost every program, right? And you mentioned that we've got the frigate now. We have the LCS problems, of which there are many, carrier problems, to say nothing of questions about what happens with the rest of the future force design. So I'm very worried about that. I know you guys have thought a lot about this, as have folks like Jerry Hendricks. I guess my guess is that if we are going to get shipbuilding back on track, it's going to require a huge investment of money. And I think John was talking about this in a really important way earlier. A lot of the early money, if it's being spent on battleships, is really probably trying to get these yards fixed and really addressing workforce challenges. Every time I talk to yards, that's the thing that they are entirely focused on, is how do you get workforce issues dealt with. And we all know it's not just a money issue. It's really about dealing in part with these personnel problems that they're having just getting skilled workers in. So I think those are questions I'll sort of defer to you guys on. But the part where I guess I'm worried about the battleship in particular is if we had a design that had been fully developed and then we were trying to do a big new project, I'd feel much more confident if it was really tested out. I think where the Navy has struggled the most is where they've tried to do something new and it's taken forever, and we've ended up in some cases with 3 ships or 1 ship or 2 ships. And what I worry about here is, I look at the budget for the battleship and there's no development money. And I don't think the battleship's fully developed. And, John was making a good case for why we should have, a nuclear reactor on the ship. I completely agree with that. But I understand the Navy wants to go fast, so they don't want to do that. But I wish we had a consolidated design, do that first, and then build the ship. I appreciate that would not get President Trump the ship that he wants before he leaves office. I think the chance of getting a ship before he leaves office is 0 right now. But for me, I'd say let's slow down. Let's actually get the design right and test it out, as John was saying earlier. And then meanwhile, let's try and get the yards up and running, maybe set up some new yards, which is something I know you guys have spent a lot of time on. But my guess is, as things have gone recently, the odds are pretty good that this is just too hard for us to do. And I guess the last question I'd ask, and Sal, John, interested in your thoughts on this, is does this take away from other shipbuilding priorities, or can you just do this at the same time? And my guess is that the Navy is going to struggle to do this and try and get, the Virginia class back on track, try and get SSBN back on track, try and get the carrier program back on track. And they're not going to do all of these well. And I guess for me, this would be the lowest priority of those 3. So I'd rather see them put the energy and, frankly, the money into some of those other systems.
Zach, if I could ask just a follow-up to that, and I'll get it over to John here in 1 second. Do you think that having that name, the Trump class associated with this, is this, if Democrats come in 28 with the presidency and Congress, I mean, is it dead on arrival? I mean, is it just dead? I mean, is there no chance of this, or do you think that there could be a chance within the next 2-3 years that, if the Navy proves the justification for it, could it even stay? Because to me, this is the problem I have with this, is you're going to invest this money into it. And I think it doesn't have the legs to stand on. Although I do think a large surface combatant is probably necessary for the Navy. I just think, when you put your name on it, you put a Trump on it, and especially him standing on the back of the stern there, with the way they have it in the images there, does this even have a remote chance of staying alive? In your opinion, you know how budgeting goes, how a defense process works.
Yeah, I don't think it does. But I think this is part of why I wanted to have this discussion with you guys, because the Navy hasn't really made the strategic case for this. And, John's making an eloquent case for why he thinks it makes sense. I'd like to see the Navy come do that. But when I talk to folks on Capitol Hill, they're not getting the pitch. And, maybe you guys have talked to Hung Kao about this. We should see the Navy, like they should actually build out the website on the Golden Fleet and explain the logic of it in detail. I think until they do that, it's going to be a very risky program. No matter what, the Democrats will take off the Trump name from everything. I'm sure day one, there are going to be crowds of people down by the Trump Kennedy Center as it turns back into the Kennedy Center. And this would be the same thing, right? The Trump name will come off on day one. But I think if they've made the strategic case for the system, maybe the system could stay. I just don't see any effort by the Navy to do that right now. It's all sort of a political argument. So I wish what John is arguing now is what the Navy was actually arguing from the podium at the Pentagon or at the White House, the detailed argument for the ship. And until they do that, I don't think there's going to be support in the Congress, especially among Democrats.
Well, I think your point, having the webpage under construction is not good. It's not a good look right there. It really is very symbolic of some of the problems that the Navy does have with this. And I will say that I think the Navy does a terrible messaging job, period. It doesn't matter what subject we're on. I think they are one of the worst at really talking about what they do, what they need. I think they're horrible about that. All right, John, we were talking about, can we even build a battleship? You were alluding to it before. What's your take?
Well, first, I want to address that point. I agree completely, and nobody is more frustrated than me on the lack of Navy communications. I talk about it all. And,
No, I'm very frustrated too, John. I'm very frustrated on this too.
Sources inside the White House, have told me that was a big reason why Phelan was let go. Not that he hasn't done amazing work in the early months, but he's not communicating all of that. And there seems to be a muzzle on a lot of these admirals. The interesting thing about this is I think I was the first person to really push this battleship about 2 years ago. And I did it as a complete lark. I just love battleships. I love World War II battleships. And I posted it. And the amount of negative feedback I got 2 years ago was intense. And I just kept posting it because it just didn't make sense to me why so many people, so many smart people were so dead set against the battleship. And simultaneously on that track, a couple of us, you, Sal, have been a big part of this. Guys like Bruce Kimbrell and Mike Waltz and everyone else, Garamendi, and even the Democrats have been pushing for this protection of merchant ships. So we were pushing the admirals for this, and while I was kind of doing this lark on the battleship, and the ideas converged as some of us started studying these battleships and what the capabilities of a modern battleship is. Just the amount of research I had to do to convince myself I was not sold on this 2 years ago. And then this is what happened in the Navy, as the Navy was pushed into, how are we going to defend these logistics ships? You had Admiral Carter was against it, Paparo was against it, Cooper was against it, and now internally, these guys are pushing it. A lot of these designs came from Paparo and Cooper. They really pushed the combatant command to try to figure out, how are we going to do this choke point logistics? And there's a lot of saying that Trump pushed this from the top. That is not what my sources are telling me. What my sources are telling me is Trump has been pushing defense of choke points very much on the top and has been hands off on how the Navy does this. And the admirals, as they look at all these other failed options, submarines, they really thought that the carrier could do more protecting merchant ships, and that failed. They came up with this, we need a bigger destroyer, but you're absolutely right, they haven't communicated it, and not all the admirals are sold. The vice Admiral Kilby, he told me straight up he does not like this idea, but I met with Caudle, and he is sold on the strategic importance of this. Going to how we build this, I was also very skeptical when I was in Samsung and I heard that Shell was building the Shell Prelude. This is the largest ship in the world. This ship was going to cost $15 billion to build at the best shipyard in the entire world, Samsung, in Korea. Now, Korea is 5 to 10 times more efficient at building ships than we are. And this ship still costs $15 billion, the same as a nuclear aircraft carrier. This is a ship that not only drills for natural gas, it's a refinery and has the cryogenic systems to cryogenically liquefy the natural gas. The size, immensity, complexity. You go look at the ship, and I've been on the ship during construction, the amount of pipes, the amount of systems on the ship was incredible. And Samsung was able to build it in a few years. They decided not to build more. The price was doing it. That ship went to Australia. But the ability to do this complexity is there. It's not here in the United States. I think Zach's excellent point about the loss of life. We Americans, we're becoming even more wary about putting servicemen at risk. I think this is a big reason why we haven't settled the Strait of Hormuz. 10 years ago, you had ship owners that were willing to risk the lives of seafarers. Now, if a missile comes down on a merchant ship, it's going straight to TikTok of the crew members bleeding out. You have real people who are identified on these ships. Parents know where their sailors are. So I think he's absolutely right about that potential to lose life. And I think, that really was why the frigate went so, got so delayed up in Wisconsin, because we took the French design and we tried to put it up into U.S. Navy standards. Well, I think, we have a choice. Do we want to lose 5,000 people on a carrier, or do we want to lose 500 on a battleship? I don't think the debate is really, if we're in a fight against China, people will lose lives, and that has to be done. But the fact so we can't build this up to aircraft carrier standards. We have to build it down to commercial standards. And if we don't do that, it's never going to be built. It doesn't matter how much it costs if we try to get the design, but we can take these commercial designs that are already there, fast container ships, we can make some changes. And I joked with a very senior Navy official the other day. I said, I feel like I am the Vietnam vet in The Big Lebowski. You want a pinky toe? I'll get you a pinky toe. I'll get it with toenail polish on. And I say that right now. You want a battleship, Trump? You want a battleship by the end of the term? I will get you a battleship. It's not going to be up to Navy life-standing standards, but it is going to be secure. It is going to be armored. It is going to be survivable. And you build that based on existing container ship designs. You build those first two in Korea. And that's what we're doing with the icebreakers, right? We're building icebreakers first in Finland as we build up the industrial base in the United States. You can get that, you bring it in, you put the guns on, and then you hand that ship over to someone like Anduril to put the distributed drone systems, to put new radar sensors on. So I think this is an opportunity. We can absolutely get a battleship built by the end of Trump's term, but can we do it in Navy yards, doing Navy specs, doing NAVC, completion of design? Absolutely not. I think this would force us to work closer with those allies and come up with new plans. And talking to Hanwha, they are eager for an assignment like this.
All right. Well, that brings us to our kind of last closing here statement. So we're going to go in reverse order. John, I'm going to have you close us out on this debate about battleships. I think it's been great listening to the two of you. I get a lot out of this, and I'm really interested in the closing on this. I think one of the issues that really looking forward to is what's the next element? What's the next steps? If we go forward with this, what do we want to see? So John, and then I'll go over to Zach.
I think steps, the Navy cannot do this themselves. This is the critical thing. And I'm trying to, talk to a few people in Hunt Cow's office. I've sat down for hours months ago with Hunt Cow. He sold on this, but you need someone to get in these other departments. All these commercial shipyards, we're not building at Navy public shipyards anymore. These are commercial entities. These commercial entities are suffering. They're not making the profits that the Navy claims. The Navy does not have authority over these shipyards. The Maritime Administration does. The Maritime Administration is sister with the FAA. They're equivalent. They used to be larger than the FAA. FAA has 40,000 people employed. The Maritime Administration has less than 800, and half of them work at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. So every time we're trying to shoehorn all these solutions in through the Navy, who doesn't understand the commercial, doesn't understand the finance. I think Phelan helped a lot with that, but they also don't have the experience in the foreign yards. Most of what Korea did was taught by the American Bureau of Shipping. American Bureau of Shipping is in Chinese yards right now. How do we pull this in? How do we pull in Treasury? How do we pull in, now we've got OMB. How do we pull in commerce? I think, we really need someone who can not do this inside the Navy. And I think this battleship project has to be separate. And I think that's my final point. As I listen to that assessment, as I listen to Zach, as I listen to the debates on Congress, everyone has excellent points. And like I said, 2 years ago, I was doing pro battleship, but I was against the battleship idea. But my question is, we cannot win a war with China without logistics. And if the battleship's not the solution, what, Zach, is the solution to protect my merchant marine? I don't think the battleship is ideal. It is difficult. There are problems with it. But my merchant ships need protection, not out in the ocean where we can separate and there are thousands of miles, and hopefully we can blind some satellites so that those missiles aren't targeted. But when we get into the choke points, that's my concern as a U.S. Merchant Marine captain. I trust the Navy is going to protect me out in the ocean and we can hide and everything else. But I need that gunfire support in the choke points. And if battleships is not the solution, then please, please tell me, what is the solution for protecting my merchant ship in a war against China?
All right, turn it over to Zach for his closing statement.
Well, I think where John ended is exactly the right point, that where a lot of us should be having a conversation that strangely isn't happening, which is, all of the services are talking about more distributed operations, right? The Army is talking about this, the Marine Corps is talking about it, the Navy is talking about it, the Air Force is talking about it. And my fear is the same as John's, that actually you can distribute capabilities, but the logistics get really, really hard. My sense is that the Marine Corps has thought a lot more about how to do this. And some of that's because they're talking about small units on the ground where they can, potentially live off of the areas that they're going to be resident in. But that if you look at what the Air Force is talking about with their concept, if you look at what the Navy is talking about in terms of its concept, I think you're right, John, that the logistics part is really not fully thought through. I think the question that I would ask, and this is probably where we differ slightly, is whether you can actually solve that problem at an acceptable cost and a risk level that the American president is going to accept. And my fear is that the answer is no, that the American president is going to keep those surface Navy assets far out of the fight early on, in which case I think we should be investing in those assets, but to a lesser degree, and probably putting less capability in one ship and putting more money into submarine construction, putting more money into sea denial, including cross-domain sea denial. And so I think that's the big debate we should be having. But I guess, Sal, maybe the place to end is, I feel like the last hour has been the first time that I've actually had a debate with anyone about some of these issues over the last, couple of months. We saw the battleship get proposed. We didn't see a lot of the details. We didn't see the kind of argument that John's making for it. We saw some pictures, but without the real justification. So hopefully this will spur a little bit more of a detailed discussion from folks in our field about the cost and benefit of the battleship going forward.
My final point to that is, the question I keep getting back to is, maybe we can't get to that fight. Maybe we have to hold back and come up with a better plan if the balloon goes up with China. But the thing I keep going back to, Zach, is we have over 300,000 military members and more dependents in Indo-PACOM. If the battleship, all it does is get our forces out, we need that. We cannot fly that number of people back to the United States. So we need a plan to get in those choke points, if only to evacuate that equipment up so that we can prepare a fight later. And I think that's why we need that battleship protecting my merchant ship to do that evacuation at the very minimum.
Well, gents, I want to thank you so much for this discussion. I think the point that John and Zach, you made at the very end there, I think is really important, is we need this discussion. We need to be talking about this. I mean, we're not a military force and not a Navy that is just one type of ship. It's not just subs. It's not just aviation. It's surface combatants too. I think we have not had that discussion about what is the next, what is after Burke? What do we get after the Flight 3 Arleigh Burkes? And that's, I think, one of the big discussions. John and I were just at Sea Air Space, where the U.S. Navy League was, and there really wasn't a lot of discussion about it. And I think that's really a key. I don't think there's a lot of discussion about key things about force structure, not just the battleships, but what do we want these ships to do? What do we want the next large surface combatant to have on it, because I think that is really what we're getting at here. And I think that the Navy needs to do a better job of this discussion. I'll be really interested to see what we get out of the conflict right now in the Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz. But my fear is it'll be a lot like the Red Sea, where we don't hear a lot and not enough critical analysis of it, and what needs to be the next thing going forward. I want to thank both of you for coming on today, and I appreciate this debate. I hope it's the first of many debates on this. For everyone who's watching this, just real quick, if you want to follow Zach Cooper, head on over to AEI. He is a massive publisher on issues associated with this. I listen to him, and John and I listen to him on the Net Assessment podcast all the time. I love the Net Assessment podcast. If I have one criticism of the Net Assessment podcast, is you got to get Chris Preble stop talking about Tennessee and their football team. It's Alabama. It's Roll Tide. My only criticism there for you is that. And then if you want to follow John Konrad, head on over to gCaptain. Check out his site. I think it's really important. I think battleships are an interesting issue. I think the name alone conjures up a discussion. And I think sometimes, we didn't have the debate, and I don't think you really need to have the debate. Is this a battleship? Is it a cruiser? I mean, it's the large surface combatant, but battleships kind of, sit in my heart. I love battleships. I was just on one the other day, and, it makes me smile when I'm on a battleship. I think a large surface combatant is something that the Navy has been talking about for a long time, whether it's the strike cruiser, the arsenal ship, kind of what John was alluding there to, the commercial built version of an arsenal ship. I think that's kind of the next thing, but we really need to have these types of discussions. I think Zach is 100% right on that. We don't have these discussions, and I think that is the key. One of the reasons why we wanted to host this. So, gents, thank you so much for coming on, spending your time with us. If you have comments, please leave them in below. I'm pretty sure we're going to get some comments. I think the other major thing that comes out of this, and I think it's probably the most important thing, is that you can actually have a critical discussion on X that leads to something productive. This is, I think, really amazing. I don't think this has ever happened before in the history of Twitter/X, but I'm happy about this. Gents, thank you so much for being with us today. And for everybody else, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Until our next episode, this is Sal, signing off.